Good day, and welcome to the Center for International Law, COP26 Conversations with leading experts on the issues and trends that are at the front and center of the climate change conversation. I'm Danielle Yao, Adjunct Senior Research Fellow and the lead on climate change law and policy issues at the Center. Our discussion today examines the EU Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulations and associated EU Taxonomy, how this relates to meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement, and its potential implications on the public international law normative agenda. I'm very pleased to welcome our guest today, Mr. Sean Kidney, the Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of Climate Bonds Initiative, that is devoted to mobilizing global capital for climate change. Sean focuses on promoting investment priorities for climate and green bonds, how governments can take advantage of the green bonds market, and the development of international collaborations. Sean is a member of the European Commission's platform on sustainable finance, as well as bodies including the French government's Green Sovereign Bond Evaluation Council, the Advisory Board of the International Sustainable Financial Center, advisory network to the High-Level Panel for a Sustainable Ocean Economy, and the advisory panel of the Nordic Institute for Finance, Technology and Sustainability, just to name a few. In addition, Sean was previously a consultant on green bonds to the United Nations Secretary General and a member of the European Commission's high-level expert group on sustainable finance. He was also a member of the People's Bank of China Green Finance Task Force, as well as a member of the Commonwealth Expert Group on Climate Finance. Sean is also a professor in practice at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. It's a great pleasure to have Sean on our discussion today. So Sean, welcome and very many thanks for appearing on this CIL special conversation. It was a pleasure meeting you in Glasgow, and I'm very glad we have the opportunity to continue our conversations today. Now, what we saw in COP26 really was a very pronounced presence of business and financial institutions. The UK's presidency program actually devoted an entire day to the theme of finance, mobilizing public-private finance flows at scale for mitigation and adaptation. The Mark Carney-led Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero saw over 450 financial firms controlling over 130 trillion US dollars in assets, committing to aligning their portfolios to net zero by 2030. That's not a simple task. It's actually quite a gargantuan task. Now, this is perhaps reflective of the increasingly, I would say, impactful role of the private financial markets in meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement, but also from really personally from a public international law perspective, the normative setting agenda of such unilateral, regional, and even private sector-led initiatives. Now, for conversation, let's turn to the EU specifically. The EU Commission's Sustainable Finance Strategy, published in July 2021, conveyed the EU's global ambition in developing the international sustainable finance initiatives and standards, sort of what you would say mainstreaming the EU sustainable finance framework, if you will, and enhancing the role of the EU taxonomy internationally. Now, this includes perhaps exporting the underlying objectives and principles to build consensus in international forums, and perhaps best encapsulated in the what the SFRD, the EU's Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, as well as the associated EU Taxonomy Regulation, which entered into force in July 2020. Now, to those listeners who are perhaps not as familiar, the EU Taxonomy for Sustainable Activities is a sort of a classification system that establishes a list of environmentally sustainable economic activities. Now, with that in mind, Sean is a real expert in this field, and you have been very much involved, I believe, in the development of the EU Taxonomy. Could you share with us what was the strategy, really ambition driving this EU's approach to sustainable finance and its reporting standards? And in this regard, how does EU taxonomy relates to the SFRD?
Well, let's step back a minute. What the EU taxonomy embodies is a particular approach, a framework to identifying what are, in the first iteration, climate consistent and climate change response consistent measures. let's think about it as a shopping list for the Paris Agreement, which essentially is what it is. Now, the shopping list concept means that you don't need to be a perfect company to participate in the shopping list. You can buy solar or buy a ragu at the shops, if you like, if it qualifies, whatever kind of company you are. And that's an idea that's grown out of the green bonds market, which is a market that's grown from, when I started, a bit over $1 billion of outstanding to green and related sustainable and social bonds, $2.5 trillion US size market, and growing fast. It'll grow about 80% by the time we get to December 31 this year, and we're expecting similar growth next year. So this is a large market. The particular feature of this market is that anyone can issue a green bond and simply say, I will use the proceeds for X, Y, and Z, and a question mark about what qualifies as X, Y, and Z. So, you know, a real estate company could invest in solar and issue a bond backed by the full assets of the real estate company where the proceeds are only used for the solar, for example. This is innovation. This is a bit different to ESG, environmental social governance mechanisms, which tend to be scoring systems for entities. So the real estate company would then be assessed on its ESG score, which has been interesting from a risk management perspective for investors starting to look at how to match long-term behaviors with short-term performance. You know, be very clear to everyone, ESG, when it's done properly, is not a sentiment-based issue. It's a risk-based issue. It's about a more complicated set of risks. That sort of idea can still apply and is still highly relevant, but we need to change things quite quickly, and we need to support companies that are simply doing the right thing, or member states or countries for that matter as well. And so we want to recognize what is the right thing in terms of our climate ambitions and allow them to, if you like, signpost and signal. And what does this signposting mean? Well, on one hand, because we have so many fixed income and now other investors concerned around climate change who are looking for quick, simple starter ways to shift their capital, they're very interested in the green bond market, because this is a market which is broadly similar risk yield to existing bonds, but has a bonus feature. You can invest in areas that are relevant to addressing climate change as an extra feature. You don't sacrifice yield in this case. And on that basis, it's grown very fast, but it's also raised this idea, oh, right, let's just think about the shopping list idea. And, you know, we developed the climate bonds, this idea of a taxonomy in 2011, 2012. In 2014, I was a member of the People's Bank of China Green Finance Task Force, and we proposed to the governor the idea of a green bond market with a taxonomy and with regulations, which they seized on and the institute. China is now the world's second largest national green bond market. And it's used from day one what was called a green projects catalogue, effectively a taxonomy to guide the market. In 2016 and 2017, I was a member of the European Commission's high-level expert group on sustainable finance. We made a similar recommendation. They adopted it. Now, let's be clear, this is a major departure from thinking about how to assess what are climate consistent investments. This is about making it very simple to know what is green, let's say, in the parlance of the Chinese taxonomy. If you're a double glazed windows manufacturer, you are green. You are deemed in the taxonomy to be green. You don't need to do carbon reporting to prove that. You don't need to hire a consultant to show why you would, et cetera, you just are. And that applies to solar, that applies to a range of areas. In some areas of the taxonomy, there are carbon metrics that are relevant. So it's a new concept, if you like, and the Commission has adopted it. The Commission went one step further, and this is where it becomes particularly relevant to your listeners, is they decided the taxonomy, this shopping list for the future, would then become a foundation for a variety of measures that would be taken in Europe to mobilize or shift capital in areas consistent with European public policy. When we started, by the way, on this process, Europe had not adopted strong 2030 targets, which is now adopted. However, we did in the expert panel and the subsequent expert panel developing the taxonomy take a lead from the IPCC 2018 report, which was very strong about the emissions reductions we had to achieve. At the end of last year, the European Union actually adopted similar recommendations, so we managed to synchronize the two work streams. In Europe, the taxonomy is not only underpinning for green bond markets, as it is in China, but more importantly, it's now the foundation for disclosure around sustainability. So under the European approach to the implementation of TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which made recommendations for what countries should do. And by the way, the first country to adopt TCFD recommendations was Japan, who introduced a voluntary measure to encourage companies to disclose their carbon-related disclosures. In Europe, this got taken to an extra level. Not only are going to end up disclosing your carbon-related high carbon investments and risks, you're also going to be required to disclose your sustainable investments if you're an investor or a bank or a corporation, and then eventually a member state, according to the Commission. But it's not quite there yet. This means the whole European financial sector will now be disclosing on an annual basis their sustainable investments using a common language. We've never had this before, a common taxonomy to decide what can be included. And we will be able to compare how funds, how banks, how corporations go in a way we've never been able to compare before. And that comparison is based on a taxonomy of climate-related investments and environmental investments, where we're looking at doing further iterations and developments and evolutions of the system, but that will guide them. So this is pretty revolutionary, actually. Now, you don't have to show what you're doing sustainable, but in Europe, if you want to use the word sustainable to describe your financial sector offerings or your reporting, you need to use the taxonomy. Sustainable is very fashionable in Europe. People are concerned about it and wanting to become sustainable. So this is quite challenging for all the corporations, because actually everyone's invented their own approach to the past. Now, I'm not saying the approaches were necessarily bad, but they were different, very different. You know, people focus on different things all the time. That's gone now. And what we are seeing is a race to the top, which is exactly what we wanted to see. We've got companies who've been trialing the taxonomy disclosure for the last 18 months now, saying, well, look, I'm going to be 12.5% sustainable, I'm 14% sustainable, I'm 23% sustainable, and so on. A clamor to the top, which is exactly what we want to do in terms of our climate targets, which are very, very tough, really. So that's the idea. So the impact for the legal profession is anyone who wants to issue a financial product, like a bond, like a fund, like a retail product, will now be governed by regulation that links back to the taxonomy. The taxonomy will become the common language you need to do. The European Central Bank has said that green quantitative easing, which is a feature of the central bank now, will be tied to instruments that meet the requirements of the European taxonomy, for example, and so on and so on. And we'll see more and more incentives coming through along these lines as well. So it's a big deal, and it's become a big deal, especially because we've had some 15 other countries around the world work on taxonomies inspired by the European and the Chinese experience, notably Singapore, that has a putative taxonomy in this area. And between China and Europe, we have, since the European taxonomy went from the European Parliament, been working on what we call a common ground taxonomy, which is the elaboration of the two to find what is equal. Like, we published a draft report on this at COP26, so the first draft is out there, but there's still work to be done.
Thanks very much. Yeah, that's a very useful overview, because I think it's quite transformational, wasn't it? The way as you described it, it covers almost all types of investment activities and issuance of bonds. But what I wanted to probe a little bit is that you said it's not actually compulsory to. The use of taxonomy is necessary if you want to ascribe a sustainability label on the investments, or or is it not actually is compulsory only in that context, or in terms of any issuance of bonds, you need to,
if you want to use the word sustainable on a financial product or a fund in Europe, you'll be governed by the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation.
So in a way, the market will, nowadays, I would imagine for practical reasons, the market generally is looking for sustainability. So whether or not it's prescribed by law, it seems to be a behavioral mechanism, isn't it?
Yeah, okay, correct. And this is a regulation that's going with the grain. It's not trying to invent something from scratch. There's no doubt that the growth of sustainable investment has been extraordinary in Europe. And we now have the majority of assets under management claiming to be ESG compatible or sustainable in one form or another. So that's already there. This is now, if you like, bringing a bit of an order to the chaos.
That's an interesting way of putting it, because that actually led, you in fact covered the question that I wanted to raise, which is really what is the effect of the taxonomy? What are the obligations in real terms it means for businesses and financial institutions? And that, I believe, something that you have already covered, because the EU taxonomy notably doesn't actually impose any obligation on financial company, firms, for example, to invest or to lend exclusively to activities that align with the taxonomy.
No, at this stage, it's a sustainable disclosure regulation, which is linked to other measures such as green quantitative easing. The disclosure then allows the European Central Bank to pursue. There's no obligation to spend money in X and Y. And of course, other countries, like in public sector lending in India or whatever, there are much tougher rules about what you've got to invest in different sectors. And Europe doesn't have those with this particular. Now, that might come in the future, depending on how much the government wants to act. What's more likely to happen, though, is bringing in concessional incentives. So, we've already seen risk weighting benefits and the capital ratio requirements of banks for small business lending.
Yeah.
Well, there's every likelihood that'll be also go towards green lending based on the taxonomy. And you can see other kinds of incentives beginning to be rolled out based on this broad common language. But at this stage, if you want to market yourself or market a product as sustainable, then you've got to use this common language. That's really what it boils down to. And if given the energy behind the sustainability or the sustainable finance sector, we expect continued growth. And I think there's a basic philosophical idea that clear market rules help markets grow. And we do have a clear set of market rules coming into play here. There are some interesting things about these particular rules. They force people to ask questions that have never been asked before a lot of times. For example, in the property sector, across the board, we've introduced this idea of do no significant harm. So you can build a railway line, but if you're building it to a coal-fired power station, that's doing significant harm, and therefore it's excluded. So there's a wide range. You can't build a solar farm in a wetland, for example. Well, in the property sector, if you're building a large housing development, you do need to ask whether you've addressed adaptation. So you've got to have an adaptation plan in place. Now, this is essential given the rapid pace of climate change. We're already seeing significant changes to the world environment. So it's a risk management issue, but it's a way of getting that question in there right at the beginning for anyone looking at sustainable finance. And there's a range of questions built into the system along those lines. If you're building a transport network, low carbon transport, rail systems, particularly electric rail systems qualify, but you do need to ask, do you have are there coastal protection issues if you're building near the coast in the Netherlands because there may be a flood, which is an adaptation question, etc., etc. So there's some interesting features of the taxonomy which extend people's understanding, which is challenging because in many cases we don't have data points yet. And there's a 2-year rolling implementation timetable for this to allow the data resources to grow. And it's certainly one thing that will be necessary. But at least we've got now a common language for what those data resources need to be. Whereas in the past, everyone's been, struggling to invent their own data and a bit of a free-for-all.
Indeed. There's always the question of what you mean when you say you're a green sustainable activity. What that really does it mean? Because it's green to you, but it could be brown to somebody else. But if I may just follow up that line when you mentioned some of the questions that were asked, and that's quite interesting. I mean, it's almost like the company having to do in the language that we are used to, sort of pre-activity environmental impact assessment, sort of. We have to ask this sort of question. The question I have though is that it seems rather qualitative. I mean, is there anyone looking behind the company's assessment and the way the company has answered those questions in the reporting? How is it actually done in practice?
Well, bearing in mind that most of the criteria are quite quantitative in the taxonomy. There are thresholds in there, for example. You need to ensure you don't have a level of emissions above a certain point, that kind of idea. Right. So it lends itself to quantitative assessment and a reporting that's quite sharp as a result, as distinct from getting an opinion from a consultant. Bear that in mind. But there is no requirement at this stage for independent review of the claims of a company. That is true. You're perfectly correct. Now, that could be an evolution, but it's not currently being proposed. We're allowing self-declaration against the criteria. But remember, this is declaration to the regulator, not necessarily declaration to a market and its caveat emptor. So the regulator has the power to inquire and look into any circumstances. So there is a potential policing role here, should there be anxieties about what's being said. And as we currently have in the market, we certainly expect many people to be assessing the claims made by larger organizations, whether they be civil society organizations or regulators in different member states. So let's see how it goes, but there's no wish to try and do something which may not be necessary too early. And certainly in the green bond market, for example, where I've been working for so many years, we have seen a very successful adoption of increasing and tighter standards on a voluntary basis. And there have been concerns around greenwashing, but those concerns are not about scams. Those concerns are about inadequate understanding of what it is we need to do to meet the Paris Agreement. And now we actually have a taxonomy which just makes that very clear, as we've done in China for the last 5 years. And so we've taken out, if you like, the heat or the anxiety around greenwashing in that sense by simply putting out a rule set, as I said earlier, a shopping list for the future. And we're very comfortable with the level of risk around any further greenwashing beyond that, because it's quite difficult. The level of disclosure is such that anyone can interrogate what you're saying. So look, let's see how it goes. And the Commission is committed to making this work. And we think, in fact, the final decision by member states, the Council of Member States, will happen next week to confirm the delegated act into force and come into force next year. Let's see how it goes. There are review clauses. There is a permanent expert committee, of which I'm a member, which stands by all this to keep making comment on the taxonomy and other sustainable finance initiatives. And if there are problems, they'll be addressed.
Okay, thanks very much, Sean. I think that's a good heads up onto some fresh developments that could happen next week for us all to look out for. I wanted to just dial back a little bit on the environmental objectives in the taxonomy regulation, just to set this in context. We talked a lot about climate change mitigation and adaptation, but there are in fact 4 other environmental objectives, if I'm not mistaken. It talks about sustainable use of water and marine resources, transitions to circular economy, for example, and increasingly important, and this was a lot of conversations in the corridors in Glasgow, the protection and restoration of biodiversity and ecosystems, almost like a mutually reinforcing systems. And I think I just wanted to flag that really just for the listeners to be to also be aware that it's not just focus on climate change and mitigation, but increasingly very integrated interdisciplinary considerations.
Look, that's absolutely right. And the goal is to try and link it to the key policy priorities of the European Union. But, I wouldn't call these separate from climate change. I would say see these as tightly integrated with climate change. Biodiversity collapse is tied to both climate change and the broader and general impact of humanity on the planet, which is, of course, contributing to climate change. Climate resilience, which is something we all need to be worried about, at the moment, because climate change is happening very, very fast. And look at the wildfires, look at the floods this year, but also look at the pandemic, which is, by the way, as a result of biodiversity collapse in Southeast Asia and southern China, forcing bat colonies together, pathogen jumping between species and then jumping to humans out of it. The IPCC Health Committee has been predicting there'll be pandemics as a feature of a 21st century of climate change. We'll see a lot more of these. So all of these kinds of indicators are part of the change we're wreaking on the world as a dominant species, which is slightly out of control, or quite significantly out of control in terms of our impact in the atmosphere. And so we see this as elaboration. So when we look at biodiversity protection, it is about not only reducing the impact of humans in a way that might allow us to be more sustainable, but it's also about improving climate resilience, because in a world of extreme climate volatility, or rather significant climate volatility, ecosystems have a habit of collapsing when they have a major shock and not recovering. The healthier they are, the less likely they are to collapse. That's what it boils down to, and you can see that in a piece of forest in Singapore. If you have an area which is degraded and run down and people have chopped some trees, as used to be the case in the old days, Singapore, there was rubbish strewn around and a storm came through, things would collapse, animals would die. If it's a healthy forest and a protected forest where this doesn't happen, it just survives different kinds of incidents much more successfully. And that not only applies to biodiversity, by the way, it applies to the human species. We are going into a world where we will see really severe physical impacts and social and economic impacts, like the pandemic. And some states have a risk of collapsing. Well, if we can address the social issues that are linked to resilience, such as, for example, the education of women. If you educate women at primary school level, they participate in the economic life of society. And that leads to improved levels of equality, which is an indicator of resilience. And it's women more than men, because women make more successful small business people. The default rate in countries when it's been tested for loans to women's small business is about 3% to 4%. The default rate on loans to men who are in small business is more like 20%. Oh, we should just restrict all our lending to women. But you get an idea of the kind of discussion that we need to start getting into to understand resilience. And this is the forward direction of the European taxonomy. But I stress that none of these things are in the current Delegated Act. The current Delegated Act is focused on climate change mitigation and adaptation. We are working on proposals in the areas you mentioned. We published some papers. We will publish further papers in January. And during the course of next year, the Commission will develop its own regulation in those areas to expand the remit of the taxonomy. It will, the social one's going to be very difficult because there is a real risk of values-based issues. Not that these are inappropriate, it is entirely appropriate for any country to be considering the values-based issues, but we want to link it as much as possible to evidence-based. And again, in Singapore, social housing, to give it, which is the dominant housing form in Singapore, is clearly critically important to giving equity of access to housing, to improving inequality, and a variety of measures. Now, in most countries, we would be saying that is an important social investment to ensure the poor can get access to housing, and we can reduce some of the risks that come with that marginalization of groups in the context of resilience needed for climate. So, you can sort of see a situation where in a year or so's time, we might see a social housing bond coming out of Singapore, which is fits into the broader extension of the green and sustainable bond market, as many social investments already are. That's the direction of travel. But what Daniel, what we need your help is we need to look to a strong evidence base here. We've got to be careful of opinion, because opinion can take us down the wrong rabbit hole. And we need the help of our academics, our universities, in thinking through, the underpinnings of what are the clear rules that we can use to guide capital.
Yeah, I think you struck on a very important point here, Sean, because the framework in its design can potentially go into many directions. as you have explained. It can potentially be expanded to cover every various parameters as well. I mean, it's quite rightly the taxonomy in Singapore does in fact talk about biodiversity, just as an example of the objectives that are common, so to speak, and that recognizes the very integrated nature of the climate and the global ecosystem. But your point about being very careful to avoid value judgments is an important one, because it brings me to the question of the kind of criticisms that has been potentially levied against a system of like the EU sort of a taxonomy system, and in fact any system which is designed perhaps within by a country or unilaterally or within the region, so to speak, because there is always a risk that when you have a value judgment placed into it, which is not backed by empirical scientific metrics that can be measured in a way, there is a risk of it becoming a fairly political exercise. And that's something I think needs to be borne in mind, I think, for researchers and legal practitioners and institutions like us. We were looking and examining this issue, because there's it's an easy window. So well, I won't call it easy, but it is a very temptation. It is a window by which we can introduce certain political considerations into a matrix, so to speak. For example, within the EU itself, there was some debates, I understand, on determination of the energy mixes of member states. And you see this controversy within the EU. I can imagine this replicated on a global scale. So I wonder whether this is something that you could perhaps speak to in terms of some of the challenges, both internally and externally, that can arise in the formulation of this kind of framework and this kind of taxonomy. Perhaps from your experience, both in the EU, working with the People's Bank of China, and also working with the Commonwealth Expert Group on Climate Finance that you were involved in previously, are there learning points that you can share on this journey?
We live in societies where we have governance structures of various sorts. In Singapore and the UK and Australia and Ireland's case, where I come, whose passport I carry, these are democracies where there are necessarily democratic process to make decisions. As an expert, we advise the democracies. We don't make the final decision. There's always a risk that decisions are not made on the basis of evidence. I mean, look at the extreme versions of those risks. Look at Trump's America, where evidence-based decision-making seemed to go out the window for 4 years. That is the nature of the political system in some of the countries we live in. Of course, in other countries, a much more of a technocratic bent, such as China, for example, there are different systems, but it doesn't mean that there aren't values-based decisions that encroach on science, which there clearly are in all economies and all situations. All we can do, especially as experts working in the area, is to make the case and to try and draw the outlines of the framework for making decisions. What we said in taxonomy successfully so far is that taxonomies need to be science-based. It's a sort of foundational principle. They need to be dynamic because science changes. For example, our understanding of what the emissions reductions pathways we need to achieve in society has changed and horribly got more difficult, unfortunately, but nevertheless, that's the nature of it. In which case, we need to change the goalposts when that happens. That's what we need to try and do. But in the European circuit, I just want to mention, however, that science is not absolute. Well, except in the areas of gravity, perhaps, where I would argue it's fairly clear. But there are areas of grey, and the evidence can be mixed and so on. And that's part of the nature of science, a process to come to a decision based on the best available evidence. It doesn't mean it's perfect. And we know it gets something, I can still remember the day years ago when I read an article by 2 Western Australian researchers on ulcers being caused by bacteria, not anxiety. And breathtaking, this seems absurd, and it was seen as absurd by the profession for some years until the evidence became clearer and clearer. So we've got to have a healthy respect for the potential for further evidence coming to light which changes our views. That's the nature of science. Having said that, it is important that we fight on the argument on these grounds. Now, in Europe at the moment, there is a debate. In fact, today I published an op-ed with 12 other colleagues in the technical expert group on one particular issue of concern in Europe, which is a push by some member states to include gas-fired power in the taxonomy under the climate change. So this is, they're pushing for an addition to the delegated act that's gone through Parliament that would come through next year, which would allow in some circumstances gas-fired power. We've yet to see what the shape would be. The Commission is drafting something in response to clear direction from member states. But the our op-ed said, look, the International Energy Agency has said very clearly in its World Energy Outlook, published a couple months ago, that there can be no new fossil fuels to meet our Paris Agreement 1.5 degree targets. That doesn't mean a close down of existing fossil fuels. It means no new. And it then means a timely phase out of existing fossil fuel, with differential in their modelling, differential phase out times for emerging markets versus rich countries. It does mean that rich countries need to be phasing out coal by 2030, not by 2040, whereas more poorer countries would then phase out their coal in the 2035, 2040 period. But that's so short that we can't build a new asset, which will have a 25 to 30 year to 40 year lifespan, because you end up going beyond the close by date we'll achieve. So, you know, that's, if you like, a very clear modelling. The IPCC said much the same thing in its 2018 report and its report early this year. So we've now had multiple reports saying this. We're saying, guys, you can't just whack something in because you think it's important. The science is very clear, and this is a discussion we're having with our policymakers. And, you know, like in every country, it's going to be the same. This will be the same in China in a different frame. It'll be the same in the US. It'll be the same in Brazil. And we need to have these discussions. We need to be robust. For those of us who are across science, it's incumbent upon us to speak the truth to our decision makers about this. And this is what we're trying to do at the moment. There is a risk. On the other hand, and on that separate question in Europe, the inclusion of nuclear. Yes. Now, we've said in the technical expert group, nuclear is low carbon. Let's be clear about that. There is no doubt about it. There are concerns about the do no significant harm issues of nuclear. You know, there are risks of accidents. We have seen some. Not as bad as everyone thought, but nevertheless, Fukushima was damn scary. Not to mention Chernobyl, not to mention the 3 Mile Island, not to mention a series of smaller incidents over time. So there are clearly risks. There are the risks of waste disposal. We do not have a solid long-term waste disposal mechanism yet. After talking and working on it for years, what we're doing is burying it deep in rock. That's really, it doesn't sound like a great waste disposal. And then decommissioning costs. So I think most importantly, nuclear, it doesn't look like anyone can build a nuclear plant quickly. And the cost has to be covered by the state. There's all nuclear plants around the world are guaranteed by the state. No insurance company would takes that insurance policy in nuclear. It has to be guaranteed by the state. So it's a bit of an academic, bit of a red herring for what we're trying to do and shift private capital in this particular area. Right. It's also a diversion in terms of our 2030 targets, because realistically now, we're not going to build any nuclear to address our 2030 targets. And I want to stress to everyone listening, in terms of what the IPCC says, it's 2030 that counts. Yes, we need to have 2050 net zero targets, but unless we get the 55% cut by 2030, we will not make 2050 because of the different impacts it has on the atmosphere, what's called the triggering feedback loops in the atmosphere. We lose the opportunity to have an impact. So in that context, I'm saying, why exactly are we talking about nuclear? I mean, who cares? Build it if you want, but it's not material for what we've got to do in the next few years. And so this is an argument in Europe. And you know how politics works. You get these wedge issues with one argument, one party putting up an argument which is to try and embarrass and complicate the other party. And I see nuclear as one of those diversionary issues that are not really material. Whereas I do see gas as material, because at the moment, fossil fuels, you know, we've got to understand the risks here. We currently have a risk, according to the climate scientists I speak to, of not only severe disruption to our economy and societies and environment this century, but we actually have a risk of extinction. That is species extinction of us, you know, because of what we're seeing now in the paleontological climatological records, the impact of
science.
climate change in the past. So, when you're thinking about this, I mean, even if it's only a 5% risk, and I think it's actually more like a 20% risk, but whatever, even only 5% risk, we wouldn't get in a plane if we thought there was a 5% risk of crashing. We wouldn't do it, and this is what we're doing with the Earth's climate. So we've got to take the fossil fuel side of it most urgently, and other areas that are contributing to emissions. I mean, you look in Singapore's region, it's forest destruction. We have to drastically reduce forest destruction. In Indonesia, the burning of all those forests, which has, of course, been so bad for air pollution in Singapore in the past, it's improving, but it's still happening. And we've got to regrow forest. In fact, in tropical zones, and as far as we can see, the best modeling we can see, we've got to grow forest cover by 50% in tropical zones, where we can really suck carbon out of the atmosphere. How do we do that, Danielle?
I would say, at least in that aspect, there's some encouraging output from Glasgow, the political commitment to end all deforestation by 2030. That is a huge move, I suppose, for the needle in the right direction. But indeed, what you say, the time is of the essence. And as much as the focus is on reducing the carbon or eliminating the carbon footprint, one way of putting it, is also the investments and the efforts in improving other non-carbon-based energy sources that it's cost-effective, that can be ramped up quickly and used efficiently, while not creating, the problem now is not creating a separate set of environmental problems, as you mentioned, disposal. Even for electric batteries, there's a real problem on disposal as well. How do you do safe disposal? So it's not, unfortunately, a linear equation. And it's a big challenge for policy, and where researchers and where experts can come in to move the conversation. I think that's a fantastic contribution that we can make. I just wanted to just end off, if I may, and seeking your views on this, because there are, as you mentioned, many taxonomies out there. Countries are doing their own. Within the ASEAN region, in fact, the ASEAN Taxonomy version 1 was just released recently along the sidelines of COP26 as well. So you see a lot of these initiatives in China. As you mentioned, this has been going on for a while, and then there's the EU-China joint common taxonomy now that's in place. Is there a risk of fragmentation or creating sort of inadvertent impediments or barriers to trade or investment? How do you integrate or ensure that the different taxonomies interoperate? In today's globe, trying to get to a common taxonomy across the globe is going to take time. So different regions, different countries are doing their own bits to move the conversation. But how do we deal with interoperability? Because companies do operate across borders. Is this a challenge? And this is a challenge. How can it be addressed?
It's a bit like trade law, isn't it? We need common frameworks across the world to facilitate trade. And we need common frameworks to facilitate shift of capital. And we need common frameworks anyway, because it's one world, one atmosphere, one climate. So we need common frameworks to facilitate the right kind of action around the world. But we don't have a world government. We do have a wide range of governments pursuing their own objectives. And we need to work within that context. There will necessarily be different national taxonomies. In ASEAN, we have different taxonomy directions happening in Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, and the Philippines. The ASEAN taxonomy framework that you refer to is an attempt to provide some complementary support to that process that's happening at a national level. There is no intention to impose an ASEAN taxonomy. ASEAN doesn't have those sort of powers, as you know. It's a way of the central banks, in fact, coming together with an ASEAN taxonomy board to support member countries. So that particular product is like a decision tree that's been published so far to guide local regulators, central banks, or governments who are working on this work. There is a risk here. Of course, there's a risk. But so far, there are two positives about this. The first positive is that we are having a global discussion about what needs to be done on climate change in a way that we haven't had in a material, let's call it procurement plan way before. And we are having boundary discussions now. So is this in or is this out? which has not been a feature, because what we tended to do is like derogate the problem and say, look, here's a methodology to sort it out. Go away and sort it out and come back. And of course, everyone gets confused or comes up with their own methodologies, and it becomes complicated. So that's positive. We do have all the taxonomies around the world subscribing to the idea of being science-based, as per my earlier comments about setting up the correct framework for that discussion. So far, so good too. We do have a lot of evidence coming out from the likes of the National Energy Agency about what needs to be done. And then at the COP, we did have a reaffirmation of the importance of addressing 1.5 degrees Celsius as a target for the Paris Agreement, noting that some countries had been saying it should only be 2 degrees, because that's all we agreed to. But now there's a very clear COP26 message coming out. Actually, we do need to get 1.5. It's quite different, by the way, because a 2-degree scenario has 2/3 the carbon budget of a 1.5 degree scenario for complicated reasons of carbon in the atmosphere. In other words, we can have a lot more coal-fired power plants under a 2-degree scenario. We can't have any under 1.5 degree scenario. So in the taxonomy conversations all around the world, we now have these common factors appearing. We also need to bear in mind something else, is that when people are doing taxonomies, what they're primarily trying to do, as per the European work or the Chinese work, is to mobilize capital. Yeah. International capital flows are very important for countries in ASEAN. So it's the rule sets in the sources of capital that are critical to reference when doing a domestic taxonomy. Now, the way I describe this is that we will have an Indonesian taxonomy. It will be a batik-colored taxonomy, but it will be structured like a Western suit. The shirt, the suit will be recognizable in framework in the same way as a taxonomy will recognize. We will recognize the structure, the detail, the framework that's in there, but there'll be Indonesian flavor to it. In the work we've just done in Colombia for the Colombian government on developing a taxonomy, it mirrors the European taxonomy, but in areas special to Colombia, it has a lot more detail. In their case, in agriculture, I think there are more fruits in Colombia than the whole rest of the world combined for reasons of geography in Colombia. So agriculture is something very special there. Okay. The European work on agriculture didn't go anywhere near the kind of complexity that needs to be addressed. Or in Chile, that has a big resource industry where they're about to embark on a taxonomy we've been supporting them on. They will look at the mining industry, which has not been a big feature of the thinking in Europe. It's not such a big source of mining sector. But of course, in Chile, you've got lithium, as you mentioned, for batteries. What are the rule sets? What makes a sustainable investment in lithium, in mining? And then you want to know flowing through the supply chain. So they will try and pick up that work to contribute to the greater global good. So note that. So every region and country is doing work on taxonomies relevant to their own areas, and they're offering it to others to use. Now, we have already a coalition called the International Platform on Sustainable Finance, which represents 50% of the world's population, which Singapore is a member of, which the EU originally convened. China and India are members, looking at exactly this question of how to harmonize different taxonomies. As I said, everyone will necessarily have clothes in their national colors, but they will be broadly the same. You know how you see those pictures of ASEAN leaders standing up at one of the annual meetings, they're all wearing the same shirt. Well, they'll all be
very familiar feature.
Exactly. They'll all have their own colors on the shirt, but they'll still look like the same shirt. And so I'm not too worried as a result. I do think there's work to be done. I think the International Platform on Sustainable Finance is an incredibly important international collaboration vehicle for it to harmonize these things. And
where's the US role in this, if I may ask, Sean? Because US is not yet a full member of the International Platform on Sustainable Finance.
No, well, the US is, let me frame it this way, is still living in the cleanup period post-Trump administration. And there's a lot to be done. But I know that they're looking at this development of taxonomies around the world, and they're considering what their role should be to contribute. if everything's happening and US investors are using a global approach, they might just decide not to bother doing anything because it's underway. If they don't need to intervene, they won't. But
the big source of capital. So I imagine that is the key market and the key set of investors.
You're right. There's a reasonable chance they will contribute. And, the logical thing for them to do is to look at the resilience side of things, which is a cross-party agenda item in the US, which is an expansion of features in the taxonomy into new sectors. But look, let's see where they go. But no, they're not party to it. Canada is, Mexico's looking at it, but in between, they haven't quite got there.
Thanks very much, Sean. I mean, it's a very key part of one of the key pieces. And one of the pieces, there are many pieces in the global climate activity and actions that can be taken. This finance was one area that I thought was useful for us to look at least as public international lawyers, and to see how that integrates. As I said, the discussion is taking place at different levels. There is no international normative, so to speak, framework at the moment. And it's a question of how we integrate and how there can be not so much integration, but also alignment, perhaps, for businesses. Is predictability and it's easy to implement a set of rules that are not conflicting with each other is often the key to a very smooth implementation. And that's perhaps why we will be looking at. And again, it reflects a theme, I think, that we saw in Glasgow, the need for international cooperation, around the world globally. Return to multilateralism has been a buzzword, and hope to see more of that. So final word to you, Sean, before we end this very fascinating conversation. I mean, we're now 2 weeks after COP. What do you think, and what are your hopes and expectations in the intervening period between now to COP27? I mean, we think, it's a year away, but in a critical year. What would you say in terms of your message?
At previous COPs, I have made a speech along the lines of this needs to be a COP of finance ministries, not a COP of climate change ministries. This COP, as you said, was very much geared towards the finance sector of the GFund announcement. But what maybe wasn't appreciated was the number of ministries of finance who sent representatives along. And that's a very important change. This is an appreciation that climate change and addressing climate change are now absolutely material to our economies and our societies and so on. And part of this has been amplified by the IEA's report, International Energy Agency's report earlier this year, as I mentioned earlier, which talked about a low carbon energy path leading to higher levels of GDP and more jobs growth than the alternative. So we're seeing this kind of messaging become material. I certainly do expect, want, hope, desire that future COPs will be absolutely meetings of ministries of finance, because this is what this is about. We do need to start looking at how our societies can survive and thrive in a world of extreme volatility, which will lead to opportunities and huge risks. We can mitigate those risks if we understand them properly. Now, this will require greater collaboration. I think your point about multilateralism is really important. The pandemic teaches us, really, doesn't it? That, well, it teaches us listen to the scientists and act quickly. That's one, which we haven't been good at doing the last 30 years. Boy, talk about driving the message home. But it also teaches us that being resilient in the faces of crisis is more than just raising the wharf levels in Singapore's wharfs. It's also about making sure our economy, our society, our people are prepared, making sure the health system allows free healthcare for all. Because if we have those migrant workers not using the health system, they will get sick, they'll probably keep working, they'll spread the disease. So we've got to tackle this on a global level now. And look at what's happening now with the Omicron in South Africa, breaking out, because the rich world has not transferred vaccines to the poor fast enough. Frankly, that's what it is, very clearly. If we had vaccination levels in South Africa anywhere near richer countries, we would have probably stopped this thing in its tracks ages ago, but it's broken away from us. And this is the lesson that we are being taught in the hard way. Work together, everyone. Work collaboratively around the world on the solutions, or else we will see implosions that infect the rest of us. And this will apply to security issues too. You know, if countries implode on our doorstep, those civil conflicts have a way of spilling over. Just look at Europe with the Syrians moving into Europe. Well, imagine a whole raft of Sahel countries collapsing under climate impact. That will be 100 million people trying to cross the Mediterranean, and it could well be happening in ASEAN as well. So collaboration is really important. Increasing the budget of the World Health Organization, of the UNHCR, increasing the ways we can work together to predict risk and mitigate risk is really important. The taxonomy is just, you know, a measure to get us thinking about what the rule sets are, what the areas of work are. It doesn't solve the problem. It helps drive us in the right direction. I'm cheered by COP and the interest in multilateralism. I'm obviously cheered by the changes of governments over the last year around the world, although I'm terrified now that we can seesaw. And one of the real dangers of climate impacts is populism. If you don't address, for example, the Pakistan economy's exposure to climate change, and you have a major incident, you've got millions and millions of young men there that would be out of work, and the prime predictor of war in the world is unemployed young men. So we have tinderboxes we're creating around the world. We've got to address these. We've got to find a way to get them to work and give them a future going forward. We can't just restrict ourselves to the UK or the US or Singapore. We've got to be looking outside of our borders to head off risks to our own material wealth. And that requires working multilaterally.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sean. I mean, that's a wonderful way to end off this conversation. And this point about security is certainly important. The UN Security Council has recognized climate change as a security issue as well. And all the points you made are absolutely valid in terms of the areas we need to focus our attention on that may sometimes be lost in the debate. And that is critically important. So thank you again, Sean, very much for this very excellent conversation. I'm glad we had an opportunity to do this after Glasgow. And I certainly hope that we have an opportunity to catch up again on another occasion where we can continue our conversation on this. And certainly we'll look out for the developments that will be forthcoming next week that you've alluded to this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Danielle, for the time.
Thank you. Absolutely. Thank you very much and have a great day.
See you later.
See you later. And thank you to our audience for listening in. And I hope you found this a fascinating conversation as well. Thank you and good day.